Picture a Soviet winter night. The air is sharp, biting at your skin, and the streets are wrapped in silence. But beneath that silence, something sinister is moving. Children vanish, bodies appear, mutilated and abandoned, and an entire city begins to live in fear of an enemy they cannot see. The police chase shadows, arresting the wrong men. Families bury their loved ones without answers. And while grief spreads like frost across the land, the real killer walks calmly through train stations, blending into the crowd, watching, waiting. Andrei Chikatilo looked like any other man, a teacher, a husband, a father. To neighbors, he was quiet, almost forgettable. But behind that mask of normalcy was a storm of rage, frustration, and violent fantasies. Here's a chilling fact. In 1984, Chikatilo was actually detained by police. Suspicion was there, but outdated Soviet blood tests failed to match him to the crime scene. He was released, and he went back to killing. That single error cost dozens of lives. The Soviet Union refused to admit that serial killers could exist in their society. To them, such depravity was a Western disease. This denial became Chikatilo's greatest weapon. Investigations stalled, evidence was mishandled, and even innocent men were executed while the true predator remained free. Imagine the tension. Investigators finally begin to see a pattern. The same train stations, the same vulnerable victims, the same brutal violence. For the first time, they whisper the unthinkable. This is one man's work. Years of fear culminated in 1990 when police spotted Chikatilo prowling a station near Rostov. He was restless, circling, watching women and children. Days later, another body was found. This time, they didn't let him slip away. Under interrogation, the mask shattered. He confessed to more than 50 murders, describing details only the killer could know. The horror was finally exposed. This wasn't just the story of a murderer. It was the story of a system too blind to see him, of families robbed of answers, and of a city haunted by the silence of denial. Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov, remains one of the most terrifying reminders that evil can hide in plain sight, and that sometimes the greatest danger is not the monster itself, but the refusal to believe it exists. If you're drawn to stories where reality feels darker than fiction, stay with us. More cases like this reveal just how far the human mind can descend. Picture a frozen landscape in rural Ukraine, 1936. A world where survival itself felt like a crime. This is where Andrei Chikatilo was born, not into warmth or safety, but into one of the darkest chapters of Soviet history. The air was thick with hunger. The Great Famine, orchestrated by the very regime meant to protect its people, had already claimed millions. In homes like his, food wasn't just scarce, it was a distant memory. Families whispered stories of neighbors who had vanished, of things too terrible to speak aloud. And young Andrei heard them all. But here's what most people don't know. Chikatilo grew up believing his own older brother had been taken and consumed by starving villagers during the famine. Whether this story was true or a family myth born from trauma, it embedded itself deep in his mind, a shadow he could never escape. Then came the war. Nazi occupation swept through Ukraine like a second wave of horror. The boy who was already withdrawn, already trembling with fear, now watched his world burn. Soldiers, screams, the smell of smoke hanging over empty fields. He became a ghost in his own life. At school, other children mocked him. He was frail, awkward, unable to defend himself. His voice barely rose above a whisper. When he tried to connect with others, especially girls, humiliation followed. Every rejection carved deeper into his sense of self. By the time he reached young adulthood, Andrei Chikatilo had learned to live in silence, to swallow shame, to bury rage so deep it seemed to disappear. But it hadn't disappeared. It was waiting. What no one could see yet, what perhaps even he couldn't see, was that beneath the surface of this timid, bullied man, something had fractured. The boy who grew up surrounded by death, starvation, and cruelty was quietly becoming someone else entirely. The cracks were forming, and soon they would split, wide open. On the surface, Andrei Chikatilo looked like any other man in the Soviet Union. He studied, he worked. He became a teacher, standing before classrooms full of children, speaking softly, grading papers late into the evening. He married. He had children of his own. He attended parent meetings, walked the same streets as his neighbors, waited in the same lines for bread. To those around him, he was unremarkable, almost forgettable. Colleagues at the school barely remembered conversations with him. Neighbors might offer a polite nod, but wouldn't linger to chat. Even his own students described him as quiet, withdrawn, a man who seemed to exist in the margins of every room he entered. But here's something most people don't realize. During all those years, Chikatilo was struggling with something he could never speak about. His intimate relationships were marked by deep, private failures. He couldn't connect with his wife the way other men did. The physical side of marriage was strained, awkward, humiliating. Each failure became another brick in a wall of shame he carried alone. Imagine living behind a mask like that, smiling at dinner tables while your mind replays every rejection, every moment of inadequacy. The frustration didn't fade. It accumulated, day after day, year after year, like pressure building in a sealed container. And here's what makes this truly chilling. No one noticed. Not his wife, who lived beside him. Not his colleagues, who worked alongside him. Not the parents who trusted him with their children. The rage, the resentment, the violent fantasies swirling inside his mind, all of it remained invisible. By the late 1970s, something fundamental had shifted inside Andrei. The tension that had been building for decades finally demanded release. The fantasies that had once stayed locked in his thoughts began searching for a way out. And in a society where everyone blended into the collective, where conformity was survival, he had perfected the ultimate disguise. He was the man no one saw coming. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person isn't the one who stands out. It's the one who disappears into the background so completely that when the horror finally emerges, everyone asks the same haunting question: how did we not see it? The storm inside Andrei Chikatilo was about to break. And when it did, the consequences would stretch across more than a decade, claiming dozens of lives before anyone understood what was truly happening. The invisible man was about to become impossible to ignore. December 1978. Winter had settled over the Soviet Union like a heavy blanket, silent, cold, unforgiving. A 9-year-old girl disappeared. Her name was Lena Zakotnova. She was walking home from school, her backpack bouncing against her small shoulders, breath visible in the frozen air. Somewhere between the familiar streets of her neighborhood and her front door, she vanished. Days passed. Search parties combed through snow-covered fields. Neighbors whispered prayers. Her parents clung to hope that grew thinner with each passing hour. Then, near the Grushevka River, they found her. The scene left even seasoned investigators shaken. The level of violence was beyond anything they had encountered in their careers. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of rage that spiraled out of control. There was something deliberate about it, something methodical. But here's what made it even more disturbing. There were almost no clues, no witnesses who saw anything unusual, no clear evidence pointing to anyone specific. The case felt like staring into a void, knowing something terrible had emerged from it, but unable to see what lurked inside. At that moment, authorities treated it as a tragic, isolated incident. Horrifying, yes, but singular. They had no idea they were looking at the beginning of something far worse. Because in the years that followed, it happened again, and again, and again. Young people began disappearing near train stations, those bustling platforms where hundreds of faces pass through every day. Some vanished from bus stops, others from markets or quiet streets on the edges of town. They were children walking home from school, teenagers running errands, women traveling alone. And then, one by one, their bodies were discovered. In forests where the trees stood thick and silent, on empty lots where weeds grew tall enough to hide secrets, along roadsides where no one thought to look until it was too late. Each scene told the same horrifying story: extreme violence, deliberate mutilation, and a level of brutality that seemed to escalate with each case. Here's a chilling detail most people don't know. Investigators noticed something ritualistic about the crime scene, the way the bodies were positioned, the specific nature of the wounds. It wasn't random chaos. It was controlled, almost ceremonial. Whoever was doing this wasn't just acting on impulse. They were following an internal script that only they understood. Veteran detectives, men who had seen war, famine, and decades of human suffering, found themselves deeply unsettled. Some couldn't sleep. Others requested transfers, unwilling to continue working cases that seemed to lead nowhere. Because despite the growing body count, despite the patterns beginning to emerge, the person responsible remained completely invisible. No fingerprints, no witnesses who remembered anything useful, no mistakes. It was as if a shadow had learned to walk among them, moving through crowded stations, blending into lines at markets, sitting unnoticed on buses and trains, always watching, always waiting for the next vulnerable soul who would cross its path. The Soviet Union, with all its surveillance, all its control, all its eyes watching its citizens, somehow couldn't see what was happening in plain sight. And as the cases multiplied, a terrifying question began to haunt the investigation. How could someone be doing this repeatedly, for years, without leaving a single trace? The answer would take more than a decade to uncover, and by then the damage would be unimaginable. The shadow was still hunting, and no one knew when or if it would ever stop. There was a problem that ran deeper than any investigation, more stubborn than any evidence, more dangerous than the crimes themselves. The Soviet Union refused to believe. In the official ideology of the state, certain evils simply could not exist within their borders. Repeat offenders who took multiple lives? That was a sickness of the West, a symptom of capitalist decay, moral corruption, the rotting underbelly of American society. Not here. Not in the socialist paradise where everyone was equal. Everyone was watched. Everyone was accounted for. To admit otherwise would be to admit failure, and the state did not fail. So when bodies kept appearing, year after year, case after case, authorities approached each one as if it were isolated, random, unconnected, just terrible coincidences in a vast country where terrible things sometimes happened. This denial became a wall that investigators kept crashing against. Evidence that suggested connections between cases was dismissed. Theories that pointed toward a single perpetrator were shelved. The very words needed to describe what was happening were forbidden in official reports. And while bureaucrats debated ideology, the violence continued. Pressure mounted on local police to solve the cases, any cases. Desperate to show results, they began arresting suspects based on the thinnest threads of suspicion. A man seen near a train station, someone who looked nervous during questioning, anyone who couldn't provide a solid alibi for the exact moment a child disappeared. Interrogation rooms became places of desperation. Officers, frustrated and overwhelmed, pushed harder. Confessions were extracted under extreme duress. Men who had nothing to do with the crimes found themselves caught in a system that needed someone, anyone, to blame. Here's a fact that still haunts the case to this day. At least one innocent man was executed for crimes he didn't commit. His name was Alexander Kravchenko, a man with a previous conviction who seemed like an easy answer to an impossible question. He maintained his innocence until the end, and he was right. But by the time the truth emerged, it was far too late. Imagine that wait. Families mourning the wrong person. The real perpetrator watching from the shadows, untouched, emboldened by every mistake. And a justice system so tangled in its own ideology that it couldn't see what was right in front of it. But then, slowly, something began to shift. A small group of investigators, forensic experts, detectives who refused to accept the official narrative, started laying all the cases out side by side. Not just reading reports, but physically spreading photographs, maps, and evidence across tables, looking for what everyone else had been told not to see. And there it was, the locations, always near transit hubs, train stations, bus stops, places where strangers naturally gathered and no one stood out. The victims, similar ages, similar vulnerabilities, similar circumstances. The violence, consistent patterns in the wounds, the positioning, the ritualistic elements that appeared again and again like a signature. For the first time, someone dared to whisper the unthinkable. This wasn't random. This wasn't multiple people. This was one person operating freely for years. One man moving through Soviet society like smoke. One man whom the system had protected by refusing to admit he could exist. The realization sent a chill through the investigation, because if they were right, if all these cases were connected, then dozens of lives had been lost while everyone looked the other way, and whoever was responsible had been watching them fumble in the dark, knowing that the very structure of Soviet pride was his greatest shield. The hunt was about to change, but the question remained. After so many years, so many mistakes, so many missed chances, could they catch him before he claimed another victim? If this story is leaving you speechless, take a moment to share it. Cases like this remind us how truth can be buried by ideology and how the cost of denial is always paid in lives. The nightmare was far from over. In fact, they were only beginning to understand just how deep it went. The investigation shifted. Finally, after years of stumbling in the dark, a strategy began to take shape. Train stations, bus terminals, transit hubs where thousands of people passed through every day. Anonymous faces in endless crowds, each one absorbed in their own journey, paying no attention to the stranger standing nearby. Investigators realized these places weren't just where victims disappeared. They were hunting grounds. Picture the scene. A bustling platform on a cold afternoon, the screech of brakes, the hiss of steam, announcements echoing off concrete walls, people rushing to catch connections, hauling bags, checking schedules, children waiting for parents, teenagers traveling alone for the first time, women carrying groceries, heading home after long shifts. And somewhere in that chaos, he was watching. Undercover officers began positioning themselves at stations around Rostov and the surrounding regions. They dressed as travelers, vendors, workers. They observed. They took notes. They studied every face that lingered too long, every man who seemed more interested in people than in trains. What they discovered chilled them to the bone. The person they were looking for wasn't lurking in shadows. He wasn't hiding his face or acting furtively. He was blending in perfectly, just another passenger waiting on a platform, just another tired commuter leaning against a pillar. He would spot someone vulnerable, a young person traveling alone, someone who looked lost or uncertain, someone who seemed like they could use a little help. Then he would approach, casually, friendly even, a brief conversation. "Do you know which train goes to?" Or, "It's cold today, isn't it?" Small talk that felt harmless. Sometimes he'd offer something, a drink to warm up, a suggestion for a shortcut, companionship for part of the journey, and then somehow he would guide them away, not forcefully, not in a way that raised alarms, just a suggestion. "There's a quieter path this way," or "Let me show you a shortcut through the woods." By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already too late. But here's where the story takes its most devastating turn. In 1984, police detained a man acting suspiciously near a station. His name was Andrei Chikatilo. There were reasons to be concerned. His behavior, his presence in the area, certain coincidences that didn't quite add up. They questioned him. They searched his belongings. They took samples for testing. And here's the detail that still haunts forensic science. The blood tests came back inconclusive. The technology of the time relied on basic blood typing, and something didn't match. Chikatilo had type A blood, but semen samples from some crime scenes showed type AB. What investigators didn't know, what nobody knew at the time, was that Chikatilo was a non sequitur, an incredibly rare condition affecting less than 20% of the population. It meant his blood type didn't show up in his other bodily fluids. The science failed to catch what should have been a clear connection. They had him, right there, in custody. The man responsible for years of horror was sitting in an interrogation room, and the evidence seemed to point away from him, so they let him go. Imagine that moment. The relief Chikatilo must have felt walking out of that police station, knowing how close he'd come. The frustration of the officers who had a nagging feeling something wasn't right, but couldn't justify holding him longer. And then imagine what happened next. He went back to the stations, back to the platforms, back to watching, waiting, hunting. For 6 more years, the cases continued. More disappearances, more bodies found in forests and fields, more families shattered, all because a blood test, based on outdated science, said the wrong thing at the wrong time. That single error, that one moment when the system almost worked but didn't quite, cost dozens of lives. It stands as one of the most tragic near misses in the history of criminal investigation. The hunter of the stations remained free, and the platforms, with their crowds and noise and endless flow of strangers, remained his territory. But time was running out. The noose was tightening, even if he didn't know it yet. And when it finally closed, the world would learn just how long he'd been hiding in plain sight. By the late 1980s, patience had worn thin. The investigation had dragged on for over a decade. Families were still waiting for answers. Bodies were still being found. And somewhere out there, someone was still moving freely through Soviet society, untouched. Investigators made a decision: saturation surveillance. They flooded train stations with undercover officers, not just in Rostov, but across the entire region. Every platform, every waiting room, every ticket booth had eyes watching. Plainclothes detectives posed as travelers, vendors, janitors. They observed every interaction, every lingering glance, every conversation that seemed just a little too deliberate. It was exhausting work, tedious, soul-crushing even. Days passed with nothing, then weeks. Officers began to wonder if they'd ever see anything, or if the person they hunted had somehow sensed the net closing and disappeared. Then, in November of 1990, at a station near Rostov, something caught their attention. A man, middle-aged, unremarkable in appearance, wearing a simple coat, carrying a briefcase like any other commuter. But he wasn't commuting, he was circulating, walking slowly along the platform, pausing near benches, watching women, watching children. His eyes followed anyone who stood alone, anyone who seemed uncertain or lost. He would drift closer, then pull back, approach, then retreat, like someone testing the edges of something, waiting for the right moment. The officers watching him felt their instincts flare. There was something off about his rhythm, his focus, the way he seemed to be hunting rather than traveling. They documented everything: his movements, his behavior, the time he spent at the station without ever boarding a train. The man's name was Andrei Chikatilo, and he'd been here before, 6 years earlier, briefly detained, then released when the evidence didn't align. This time, they didn't approach him immediately. They watched, they waited, they let him leave, then followed him at a distance, building a profile of his patterns, his routines, his territory. Then, days later, a body was discovered, in the woods near that very station, fresh, recent, the same ritualistic violence, the same signature. That was it. No more waiting, no more second-guessing. On November 20th, 1990, police moved in. They stopped Chikatilo as he walked near the station, calm and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. He didn't resist, didn't run. He simply looked at them with an expression that was almost blank, neither surprised nor afraid, just empty. They brought him in for questioning. At first, he denied everything, acted confused, gave answers that seemed reasonable on the surface but unraveled under scrutiny. Where were you on this date? Why were you at that station? Can you explain these inconsistencies? The pressure mounted. Hour after hour, day after day. Interrogators worked in shifts, but Chikatilo sat in that room, seemingly unshakable. Here's something most people don't know. The breakthrough came from a forensic psychiatrist named Alexander Bukhanovsky. He had spent years studying the case files, building a psychological profile of the perpetrator. When he entered the interrogation room, he didn't accuse. He spoke to Chikatilo as if he understood him, validating the internal torment, acknowledging the complexity of what had driven him. It was a risky strategy, but slowly, carefully, the walls began to crack. Chikatilo's voice changed, his posture shifted. The mask he'd worn for decades started to slip. And then he began to talk. What came next shocked even the seasoned investigators who thought they'd seen everything. Chikatilo didn't just confess to a few incidents. He confessed to 56 separate cases, 56 lives taken over the course of 12 years. He described locations, victims, details that only the person responsible could possibly know. Some bodies had been found years earlier, others hadn't been discovered yet. He spoke methodically, almost clinically, recounting each one as if reading from a catalog. The investigators sat in stunned silence, realizing the true scale of what they'd been chasing. This wasn't just a series of crimes. It was a systematic pattern of violence that had stretched across more than a decade, claiming victims in multiple regions, creating a trail of devastation so vast it seemed almost incomprehensible. Families who had been waiting years for closure suddenly had answers. But those answers brought no peace, only the horrifying confirmation that their loved ones had crossed paths with someone who saw them not as people, but as opportunities. The man who had been invisible for so long was finally visible. The hunter of the stations had been caught. But even in custody, questions lingered. How had he done this for so long? How had he walked among them, worked beside them, lived a seemingly ordinary life while carrying such darkness inside? The confession was complete, the evidence overwhelming, and the Soviet Union, the state that had refused to believe such a person could exist within its borders, now had to face the undeniable truth. The nightmare wasn't over. It had simply entered its final, most disturbing chapter. The interrogation room was silent, except for the sound of his voice. For days, he had resisted, deflected, denied. But now, with the mask finally shattered, Andrei Chikatilo began to speak. And what poured out wasn't just a confession. It was a catalog of nightmares. He described approaches with unsettling precision, the train stations where he first spotted them, the casual conversations that seemed harmless. The moment he guided them away from the crowds toward quiet paths, isolated woods, places where no one would hear. Each detail was something only the true perpetrator could know. The locations, the timing, the specific circumstances of each encounter. Investigators sat across from him, pens hovering over notepads, their faces growing paler with every new revelation. Some of these cases they recognized immediately. Bodies that had been found years earlier. Cases that had gone cold. Files gathering dust in evidence rooms. But others they didn't know about yet. He directed them to places they hadn't searched. Forests where remains had been hidden beneath fallen leaves and winter snow. Empty fields on the edges of forgotten towns. Sites that had been passed over because no one thought to look there. Recovery teams were dispatched. And one by one, they confirmed what he'd said. The horror wasn't theoretical anymore. It was tangible. Measurable in the number of excavation sites, in the remains carefully documented, in the families who received phone calls they'd been dreading for years. Here's something that still haunts the case. Among his victims were boys, girls, teenagers, and adult women. The youngest were barely 9 years old, the oldest in their 40s. There was no single profile, no predictable pattern that might have helped earlier investigations connect the dots. In total, more than 50 separate incidents were attributed to him, 50 lives, each one a world of potential, snuffed out by a man who saw them as nothing more than opportunities to fulfill his darkest urges. For families who had spent years suspended between hope and grief, clinging to the possibility that their loved one might still be alive somewhere, somehow, these confessions brought a devastating finality. The search was over. But closure didn't bring peace. It brought only the confirmation of what they'd feared most. Mothers who had waited by windows, watching for children who would never come home, now had to reconcile years of hope with the brutal truth. Fathers who had filed missing persons reports and pressured police for updates now understood why those leads had led nowhere. The person responsible had been moving freely all along, protected by a system that refused to believe he existed. But here's where the case took an even more disturbing turn. The scope of the tragedy revealed something far worse than individual evil. It exposed systemic failure on a massive scale. Chikatilo hadn't operated in secret, hiding in some remote corner of the country. He'd walked through train stations crowded with police. He'd lived in communities where neighbors knew his name. He'd worked in schools where parents trusted him with their children. For more than 12 years, he had been active under the watch of one of the most surveilled states in history. The Soviet Union, with its KGB, its informants, its ideology of total control, had somehow allowed this to continue, not because they lacked resources, but because they couldn't admit such a person could exist within their borders. Every missed opportunity, every mishandled piece of evidence, every innocent person arrested while the real perpetrator walked free, it all pointed to a truth no one wanted to face. The system itself had been complicit through its denial. As the confessions continued, investigators realized they weren't just documenting individual cases. They were mapping the architecture of a tragedy that could have been prevented. Each victim represented not just a life lost, but a failure compounded by outdated forensic methods, by ideological blindness, by the refusal to see what was happening in plain sight. The families sitting in courtrooms, holding photographs of their lost loved ones, weren't just grieving individuals. They were witnesses to how denial at the highest levels had cost their children, their sisters, their mothers, everything. The man who had been invisible for so long was now painfully, horrifically visible. But the questions his confessions raised about accountability, about institutional failure, about how many lives might have been saved, those would haunt the case for generations. Because sometimes the greatest evil isn't just one person's darkness. It's an entire system's refusal to acknowledge that darkness exists. And in the end, that refusal had allowed Andrei Chikatilo to become one of the most prolific offenders in recorded history. Not despite the Soviet state's power, but because of it. The confessions were complete, the horror fully revealed, but the reckoning with what it all meant, that was just beginning. April 1992. The courtroom in Rostov was unlike any other in Soviet history. Security was overwhelming. Armed guards lined every wall, metal detectors at every entrance. The air itself felt thick with tension, as if the room could barely contain the weight of what was about to unfold. And then he entered, Andrei Chikatilo, escorted by officers, moving slowly toward the defendant's cage, a literal iron enclosure in the center of the courtroom. It was a stark, almost medieval image, a man behind bars, surrounded by hundreds of eyes filled with rage, grief, and disbelief. The cage itself became symbolic. In Soviet courtrooms, it was standard practice to place defendants in these enclosures during trial, but for this case, it felt different, necessary, as if the bars were the only thing standing between him and the fury of everyone present. The families were there, dozens of them. Mothers clutching photographs of children who would never age beyond the images frozen in those frames. Fathers whose hands trembled with suppressed anger. Siblings who had spent years wondering what happened, now forced to sit meters away from the person who had all the answers. Here's something most people don't know. Chikatilo's behavior during the trial was deeply unsettling, even to those who had studied him for years. He would sit quietly for long stretches, almost catatonic. Then suddenly, without warning, he'd erupt, shouting incoherently, waving his arms, making bizarre gestures. At one point, he pulled down his pants in the courtroom, causing chaos and confusion. Psychiatric experts debated whether this was genuine mental deterioration or a calculated performance designed to support an insanity defense. The truth likely lay somewhere in between, a man whose mind had fractured under the weight of what he'd done, yet still aware enough to manipulate his presentation. The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically. Confessions that matched undiscovered crime scene, forensic analysis linking him to remains found across multiple regions, detailed reconstructions of his movements, cross-referenced with dates when people disappeared. Each piece of evidence was another nail, each testimony from investigators recounting what they'd found, another wave of anguish washing over the families in attendance. The courtroom atmosphere was electric with emotion. Some family members shouted at him, others wept silently. A few sat stone-faced as if any expression of feeling would shatter them completely. The trial stretched on for months. Every session brought new revelations, new confirmations of the scale of what had happened. By the time the prosecution rested, there was no doubt left, no room for alternative theories. no possibility of mistaken identity. The verdict came down with the force of inevitability, guilty on 52 counts. The number was staggering. 52 lives, 52 families, 52 futures erased. The sentence, death. In the courtroom, the announcement brought mixed reactions. Some family members nodded, satisfied that justice, however delayed, was finally being served. Others showed no reaction at all, too exhausted by years of grief to feel anything resembling relief. Chikatilo himself seemed almost indifferent. He had confessed to 56 incidents, but the court confirmed 52. The difference hardly mattered. The outcome was certain. 2 years passed. 2 years of appeals, procedural reviews, the slow machinery of a legal system ensuring every protocol was followed. And then, on February 14th, 1994, a date chosen without apparent irony, the sentence was carried out. He was executed by a single shot. Quick, clinical, final. But here's the haunting truth. His physical end didn't close the emotional wound he'd left behind. For the families, justice and healing were not the same thing. The man responsible was gone, but the absence he'd created in their lives remained. The children who never came home, the sisters who vanished on ordinary afternoons, the mothers who disappeared between errands. Those losses didn't end with a courtroom verdict or an execution. And beyond the individual families, the case left a scar on Soviet and later Russian society itself. The name Chikatilo became shorthand for institutional failure, for what happens when ideology blinds a system to reality, for the devastating cost of denial, pride, and bureaucratic rigidity. Investigators who worked the case carried it with them for the rest of their careers. Some spoke publicly about the mistakes made, the opportunities missed, the lives that might have been saved if the system had been willing to acknowledge what was happening sooner. Forensic experts pointed to the case as a turning point, proof that Soviet methods needed modernization, that international cooperation in criminal science wasn't a sign of weakness, but of pragmatism. The families, meanwhile, became reluctant advocates. Some pushed for reforms in how missing persons cases were handled. Others worked to ensure that victims weren't forgotten, that their names remained part of the historical record rather than being reduced to statistics in a file. Here's a detail that still resonates. In the years following the trial, several books, documentaries, and academic studies examined the case, not just as a chronicle of one man's crimes, but as a sociological examination of how an entire state apparatus failed its people. The case became required study material in criminal psychology programs, a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing ideology to override evidence. But perhaps the darkest legacy is this: the lingering question that no trial could answer, no execution could resolve. How many tragedies could have been prevented if the system had admitted sooner that such a person could exist in their society, if the forensic technology had been more advanced, if the innocent men arrested early in the investigation had been released faster, freeing resources to pursue the real perpetrator, if the blood test in 1984 had been interpreted correctly. Each "if" represents lives that might have continued, families that might have remained whole, futures that might have unfolded. That's the shadow Chikatilo left behind. Not just the horror of what he did, but the preventable nature of so much of it. The reminder that sometimes the greatest danger isn't the individual committing the acts, but the system's inability or unwillingness to see them. Decades have passed since the trial. The courtroom has heard other cases. The families have aged. Some have passed away themselves, taking their grief with them. But the questions raised by this case remain painfully relevant. How do we balance ideology with reality? How do we ensure that pride doesn't prevent us from acknowledging uncomfortable truth? How do we build systems that protect people rather than protecting the system's image of itself? These aren't just historical questions. They echo through every case where institutional failure compounds individual tragedy, where denial costs lives, where the refusal to see becomes as dangerous as the threat itself. The trial of Andrei Chikatilo ended in 1992, but the reckoning with what his case revealed about power, denial, and the cost of looking away, that continues. And perhaps that's the most important legacy. Not just remembering what happened, but understanding why it was allowed to happen for so long. Because some stories don't just end. They warn us. They challenge us. They demand that we do better. If this case has left you with questions about how systems fail and what we can learn from history's darkest chapters, you're not alone. These are the conversations that matter, the ones that push us to build a world where such tragedies become harder to repeat. Picture a quiet moment, years after the trial, after the headlines faded, after the courtroom emptied and the cage was dismantled. A mother sits alone, holding a photograph worn soft at the edges from years of touching. A father walks past a train station and pauses, remembering. A sister lights a candle on a birthday that will never be celebrated. The story of Andrei Chikatilo isn't just the story of one man's descent into darkness. It's the story of a system that couldn't, or wouldn't, see what was happening right in front of it. A system so convinced of its own infallibility that it chose ideology over evidence, pride over protection, denial over truth. It's the story of investigative mistakes that compounded with each passing year, the wrong people arrested, the right person released, the forensic technology that failed at the crucial moment, the witnesses who saw something but weren't believed, the patterns that were there all along, waiting to be recognized. And perhaps most painfully, it's the story of families suspended in a terrible limbo, not knowing whether to grieve or to hope, whether their loved ones were still out there somewhere or gone forever. Years of waiting, years of wondering, years of living in the agonizing space between what they feared and what they couldn't bring themselves to accept. Here's what makes this case truly haunting. The brutality of the individual acts is undeniable, but the aspect that continues to disturb criminologists, historians, and anyone who studies this case isn't just what happened, it's how long it was allowed to continue. This occurred in one of the most surveilled, most controlled states in modern history. The Soviet Union had eyes everywhere. Informants in neighborhoods, police at every station, a system designed to know everything about everyone. And yet, for more than 12 years, one man moved through that system undetected. Not because he was a criminal mastermind, not because he had special training or connections, but because the very structure meant to protect people was built on a foundation of denial. The Soviet ideology insisted that certain evils only existed in the decadent West. To admit otherwise would be to admit failure. And so evidence was compartmentalized, patterns were dismissed, and warnings were ignored. Not because investigators weren't capable, but because the system itself refused to acknowledge what they were seeing. Decades have passed since Chikatilo's execution in 1994. Generations have grown up knowing his name only as a footnote in history books. But the question his case raises hasn't aged at all. How many tragedies could have been prevented if the horror had been recognized sooner? If the system had valued truth over appearance? If forensic science had been modernized earlier? If the first serious suspect in 1984 hadn't been released on a technicality? If institutional pride hadn't prevented international cooperation that might have brought fresh perspectives? Each if represents a life, a future, a family that might have remained whole. Here's a fact that still resonates with anyone who studies institutional failure. Researchers estimate that had Chikatilo been apprehended even 5 years earlier, after the patterns became undeniable, but before the system fully acknowledged them, roughly 30 lives might have been spared, 30 people who disappeared in the years between when the evidence pointed clearly at a single perpetrator and when the state finally admitted such a person could exist. That's not speculation. That's the documented timeline of the case, measured against the body count. Think about what that means. Think about the weight of those lost years. The children who were in elementary school when the first incident occurred and were teenagers by the time he was caught. The families who aged a decade while waiting for answers. The communities that learned to live with fear as a constant companion. The darkest legacy of the butcher of Rostov isn't just what one man did in the shadows of train stations and forests. It's what an entire system failed to do in broad daylight. It's a reminder, stark and uncomfortable, that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from the person committing the acts. It comes from the institutions that can't see them, the bureaucracies that won't acknowledge them, the systems that prioritize their own image over the people they're meant to protect. This case stands as a warning across time, not just about individual evil, but about collective blindness, about what happens when we refuse to look at uncomfortable truths because they contradict what we want to believe about ourselves, our communities, our nations. And that warning is universal. It crosses borders and ideologies. It applies whenever institutions choose denial over acknowledgement, whenever systems protect themselves rather than the vulnerable, whenever pride prevents necessary change. The families who lived through this, those who are still here, carrying their loss like a weight that never lightens, they understand something the rest of us can only glimpse, that closure and justice are not the same thing, that knowing what happened doesn't erase the years of not knowing, that even when the perpetrator is gone, the absence they created remains. Some of those family members became advocates. They pushed for reforms in how missing persons cases are handled in Russia. They fought to ensure their loved ones were remembered as people, not statistics. They transformed their grief into purpose, channeling pain into preventing future tragedies. Others simply tried to survive, to rebuild, to find some way forward in a world permanently altered by loss. Both responses are valid. Both are testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable circumstances. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you've traveled through one of history's darkest chapters. You've seen how one man's pathology intersected with systemic failure to create a tragedy that spanned more than a decade and claimed over 50 lives. Take a moment and reflect. What aspect of this case disturbed you most? Was it the individual acts themselves? The institutional denial that enabled them? The families who waited years without answers? The innocent people wrongly accused? The moment in 1984 when everything could have ended but didn't? These aren't just rhetorical questions. They're invitations to think critically about how we structure our systems of protection and justice, about what we prioritize, about what we're willing to see and what we're too comfortable to acknowledge. If this story has affected you, and how could it not, consider what lessons it holds for today, for how we respond when uncomfortable patterns emerge, for how we balance institutional pride against individual protection, for how we ensure that ideology never again blinds us to reality. Join the True Crime Dossier community by subscribing to this channel. Share this story with others who value understanding history's darkest moments so we can build a better future. Leave your thoughts in the comments about what this case teaches us about systems, denial, and the cost of looking away. Because some stories don't just end when the courtroom doors close or the headlines fade. They continue. They echo. They haunt the world for generations, not to traumatize us, but to teach us. Not to sensationalize tragedy, but to honor those lost by ensuring their stories serve as warnings we cannot ignore. The case of Andrei Chikatilo closed in 1994, but the questions it raised about vigilance, about institutional courage, about the price of denial, those remain open, and they're waiting for answers we must provide.